Well, this is chapter 2, page 1, World Civilizations, Western Asia and Europe, so more commonly known as the Middle East. And I guess the main civilization or focus for this chapter would be Egyptian civilization, although we will talk about others. 3500 to 500 BC is the time period. So we start out with Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, and of course those two rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. So you can see the Mediterranean Sea, you've got the Red Sea, actually Red Sea over here, Persian Gulf, you've got the Caspian and the Black, so surrounding this area. The two rivers come up like this. The Tigris is the one on the top. I guess this map shows it over here. Euphrates on the bottom. They actually come together, those two rivers, and form what is called the Shatt al-Arab. And an interesting fact that I talk about in geography is that there once was a city that was located right on the Persian Gulf. And I don't know how many hundreds of years ago, but today that city is located 75 miles from the Gulf. So the repeated flooding and water continuing to go down there carried silt and sediment and just filled that area in until it's no longer as big as it used to be. Okay, the Fertile Crescent is rich soil in an arc from the Mediterranean Sea over here on the west over to the Persian Gulf on the east. And so again, you can see very green conditions, maybe not what we typically think about as we think of the Middle East or North Africa, for example. But yeah, this Fertile Crescent is that rich arc in what is called Mesopotamia. Okay, the Sumerians were creators of the first Mesopotamian civilization, and it combined people from Assyria, Akkad, and Sumer. And of course, Sumer is where the name Sumerians comes from. This group, as most of these groups are, well, the exception, I guess, of the Egyptians, no, excuse me. So polytheistic is the belief in many gods. Definitely Egyptians were polytheistic. There were some of the other religions that were monotheistic. Sorry. Okay, a city-state is the basic unit of Sumerian civilization. We'll really talk about city-states when we get to Greek civilization. But basically what you have is a settlement or village over here and maybe one across the mountain over here. And because of the time period, there's not a lot of contact, definitely no cell phone communication. So contact with those groups would be difficult. For example, we're over here in Fillmore, and across the mountains, it's a fairly big mountain range. The peaks of these are a couple of them over 10,000 feet. But if you go straight through, Richfield's about 20, 25 miles away. But we have to go around the mountains, and it takes us about an hour and 5 minutes to get there. So if you can imagine living back then, if there was a settlement clear over there, and we're over here, how much contact would we have? You'd have to walk, ride a horse, anyway, the communication just would not be what it is today. And so these areas developed basically independent of each other. It was almost like they were their own country, and that's why we use the name city-state. Okay, a ziggurat is a massive stepped tower on which a temple dedicated to the chief god or goddesses or goddess of a city-state was built. These were in the central part of most cities, different than the Egyptian tombs. The pyramids were tombs, where these were places of worship. And you can see the different stairs that were built. They were a stepped pyramid shape, but again, the purpose was for worshiping, religious. Okay? Theocracy is a government by divine authority. So the theo part is For example, a theologian, if you're a Bible scholar, you might be called a theologian. Then the C-R-A-C-Y part would be the government name, like democracy. And so you have for example, the Pharaoh is a religious leader. He is almost viewed as a god, but he's also the person ultimately in charge of the civilization, that empire, the culture. Now they did have other people that were, kind of took care of the day-to-day responsibility of government, but ultimately it was the Pharaoh. So he was, instead of being two people, it was the same person, and that's what a theocracy is. Okay, cuneiform or cuneiform, it means wedge-shaped, and it's a system of writing by the Sumerians, and it might also be one of the earliest forms of writing, 3200 BC. So you've got this piece of soft clay, and you can see they take this wooden stylus. It has a little wedge shape on it, broad across the top, and then it comes to a point, and they can take that and push it into the clay, turn it different directions, and make all kinds of different symbols, and that's how they created their language. So here's an original pictograph. The position later in cuneiform, early Babylonian, you can see some of the wedge shapes showing up. The Assyrian, and then what the original derived meaning is over there. So, and then after they had this written on, they would just bake it or let it sit out until it dried. So you had then a more permanent record. Epic of Gilgamesh, a poem that tells about the legendary king named Gilgamesh. It's also tells of a great flood story. I'm sure it's probably the same story that we all know about, the Noah and the Ark flood story of 40 days, 40 nights of rain, and no land whatsoever. They had to keep animals, they had to keep their food. But anyway, that flood story is listed in this. And an epic, of course, is a great poem. Okay, Sumerian technology. The wagon wheel, one of the most important inventions in our life. You look around today, and if you don't believe that, you just look at how many things depend on the wheel or something around to do a job. Potter's wheel, sundial, arch, bronze, mathematics, astronomy, mud bricks, still used in that area today. Dome, woolen textiles, irrigation and drainage ditches, and the stylus. So this is a really crude wheel, but you can see this little diagram, okay? So when people were dragging things across the ground, if they happened to roll over a log or a small branch or something that would move fairly easy, they realized that, when it comes up on that branch, it's much easier to pull. The weight is no longer dragging on the ground. The weight is still there, but it's being made much easier because there's less friction as it rolls across that log. They decided making a sled or a sledge where they have just two runners and there's less friction again from that. Then you combine the two, having the sled go over the log would eliminate even more friction. Ultimately, little marks were starting to be made in these logs. So one thing I forgot to mention back here, so once they realized, rolling this over these logs is easier, they would probably find the roundest, best logs that they could, all same size, and then they would just keep putting them in front of that rock or whatever it is they're moving, and that would just make it much easier. They could just keep, so they're just pulling it along a series of logs. But again, that would get old and tiring, and eventually with these marks, they could say, well, you know what, how about we find some way to attach it to that wheel or that axle? And so eventually to an early wagon wheel. Some of the other things, there's the sundial, the arch. Again, pottery, if you make it on a potter's wheel where it spins around, it's much stronger because it's uniform in size, shape. You just draw up the sides and just makes it a much better vessel. And then of course the mud bricks. So they would mix these with straw and let them sit out in the sun and bake. And again, they're still used today making homes and small buildings. Sargon was the leader of the Akkadians, and he overran the Sumerian city-states and set up one of the first empires in world history. And this was about 2340 BC. Still in this same area, okay? And so, by definition, an empire, a large political unit or state, usually has a single leader, and it controls many different peoples and territories. So you have this entity, they've gone out into other parts, they've taken over other smaller civilizations, other city-states, if you will, and they now become part of their entity or that unit, so it becomes bigger. So if it's controlling other people and land, it becomes an empire. And, I was looking for the name. This is Achaemenid's empire. Many, kind of interesting, many different empires throughout history have kind of claimed this area. The Persian Empire with Alexander the Great took in a lot of that. Charlemagne's empire had a lot of that same territory. Anyway. Okay, and that's the end of page 1. Thank you.